Good day, and welcome to the fifth podcast in our series, A Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service. I'm your host, Geoff St. John, and with me today is Samuel Group Technical Specialist Petty. This series has been put together by the Policy Insights Forum, a unit of the Samuel Group of companies. We're honored today to have with us Mr. Ward Elcock. Mr. Elcock has held numerous key positions in the federal government. I had the privilege of working for him when he was the Deputy Clerk, Security and Intelligence at the Privy Council Office, and he was simultaneously the Senior PCO Legal Counsel. He was subsequently Deputy Minister of National Defence, and later the Canadian Government's Special Advisor on Human Smuggling and Illegal Migration. But of the greatest import for our podcast today, he was from 1994 to 2004 the Director of CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. The issue of today's podcast is whether any Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service should or should not be part of CSIS. Sir, it's good to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Let's begin with the overarching question, that is, should Canada, in your judgment, create a foreign intelligence service, one similar to the British or the Australian Secret Intelligence Service?
Let me answer that in a little more complicated way than you might expect. I've listened to the earlier podcasts, and I'm not sure all of your earlier correspondents have quite got it right. The reality of what we have in this country, take a step back for a second. The standard normal division in most countries is to have a domestic intelligence service and a foreign intelligence service. And those services essentially cover pretty much the same ground in the sense that one does security and intelligence within the country, and the Foreign Service does intelligence collection outside the country. And that includes both security intelligence, working against terrorist organizations, dealing with counterintelligence issues and so on, as well as, in the case of foreign intelligence agencies, collecting information of utility to the government on a wide range of topics. Domestic services do many of the same things. And in most cases, domestic services also collect foreign intelligence within the country. And while some people may think that that's a bit of a joke to collect foreign intelligence within a country, I guess the example I would give you is of the small dispute between Turkey and Saudi Arabia over the murder of Khashoggi. If the Turks had intelligence in Saudi Arabia about that incident, that would have been one thing, but in the case of actual event, clearly they had intelligence from within inside Turkey. They clearly had wired the Saudi mission in Turkey and had full coverage of what transpired. May have been post-factual, but they had full coverage of the event. And that demonstrates, I think, how effective foreign intelligence collected within inside a country can be, even if many people would believe that it's much more effective to collect it abroad. When you think about it, the one place where all of the information about a country is collected is in the embassy of a foreign country in that country.
Yes.
And so it isn't a joke to collect foreign intelligence inside a country. It's actually a very effective way to do it. In the case of Canada, our situation is a little bit different. CSIS, when it was established, was responsible for collecting security intelligence related to threats to the security of Canada, but that collection is not limited. It's not limited to Canada. So it can operate to collect that kind of information both inside Canada and outside of Canada, and has historically done so increasingly. It started slowly, and I'm sure that that it is not as much as one would like, and probably because it is much more expensive and sometimes more complicated to do. But the reality is it has operated in terms of collecting threat information for many years outside of the country and inside the country. It has also been responsible for collecting foreign intelligence inside of Canada, not unusual for a domestic security service.
Yes.
Outside of the country, it is not permitted to collect foreign intelligence. And that foreign intelligence does not include threat-related intelligence. It's really the nice-to-know intelligence that governments would like to have to make their job easier in dealing with their foreign competitors or adversaries, or sometimes even friends. Would be wrong to say that we have a foreign intelligence service but we certainly have the beginnings of a foreign intelligence service, and it certainly does some of the things that foreign intelligence services do. Although I would concede the point that collecting information on threat-related subjects like terrorism or counterespionage and so on can sometimes be less complicated than, say, trying to find out nice-to-know information in another country where you have to suborn the secretary of a minister in a foreign government to try and find out information about a contract that is of interest to Canada. That's obviously much more complicated than the issue of dealing with terrorist issues, which are often cooperative, but not always cooperative, because there are more than a few
Yeah.
countries where we would not be able to cooperate with that country on a terrorist issue and would have to operate independently if we were to do so in that country. So our situation is a little more complicated. We do have the beginnings of foreign intelligence collection in a sense. We don't have a full-fledged foreign intelligence service. That would be correct. Should we have a foreign intelligence service? Your original question, I think the answer to that is that it probably would be a good idea. I don't particularly have an objection to having a foreign intelligence service. I guess I would say in response that this is frankly not the time and the place to deal with that issue. And I say that largely because there's some much bigger fish out there to fry that the government needs to deal with before we start thinking about a foreign intelligence service. A foreign intelligence service will take 10 to 15 years to establish itself at the very least. Even the
Yes.
service, which started with a capacity from the old RCMP security service, took 10 to 15 years before it became really fully operational and up to the mark. So it's a long and expensive operation. We still can't put enough money into our military. We still probably are not putting enough money into our own intelligence service, our domestic intelligence service, and are not probably operating in a fully effective way, in the sense that we have certainly over-regulated it and over-examined it with all of the review agencies that successive governments have created. So I'm not sure that this is the time or place to. We have a lot of other priorities. I don't think a foreign intelligence service is necessarily the highest priority.
Right. Let's assume, though, for a minute, that the government of Canada decided to establish a foreign intelligence service. This brings up the question, should it be part of CSIS or should it be a separate agency? What are your views on that, Mr. Elcock?
My view on that, frankly, would be that it probably, to be successful, would have to be part of CSIS. There are some who might argue that at a later point you might want to separate that. That's an issue for later generations. Frankly, for it to be outside of CSIS would make very little sense. If you were to establish such a new organization, the only place you would be able to recruit, the only place you could recruit significant numbers of people to staff such an agency would be from CSIS. So you'd have to rob Peter to pay Paul. There are not a lot of other places to get recruits from, or trained recruits. You could derive some from other agencies, but in my view, that would probably, except in small numbers, be a mistake. So starting it within CSIS, frankly, would make the most sense if one were to do it. And frankly, I think that actually works. A number of other countries have done it to greater or lesser extent, also have a responsibility for foreign intelligence.
Given that many of our key allies have separate services, are the circumstances in Canada's case it would prompt us to have two services under a single roof?
I think the reality is that CSIS has for a number of years been operating both with, CSIS doesn't simply cooperate with domestic security services. It also works, it has worked for years with foreign intelligence services and has ensured that it has people. I don't know to what the numbers are like these days, but certainly people have been trained in foreign intelligence agencies in the past. The service has made an effort to ensure that it has people who are trained to do different kinds of work. I don't see that as a particular problem. Those relationships already exist and presumably would continue. The idea that there is some fundamental difference between what foreign agencies do and what domestic agencies do is, I think, a little misplaced. I think actually one of the biggest problems, frankly, would be the need to ensure that the identities of people in that part of the service that were engaged in foreign collection were much more tightly protected than perhaps those who operate domestically are protected. But the reality is even those are protected these days in many cases.
You mentioned that you felt it would take 10 to 15 years for a service to get its feet on the ground and become fully operational. I've actually seen another estimate which said it could take as long as a generation to do. Another question that comes up, CSIS is a law-abiding agency, and a foreign intelligence service is by definition a law-breaking agency in that it must break the anti-espionage laws of foreign countries it spies on. Could two such services continue to coexist under a single roof?
In a sense, they already do, in the sense that in some cases the service is not operating with the consent of a foreign country or with the knowledge of a foreign country in a foreign country. I don't think that that's a huge departure. And I think the reality of Canada's intelligence agency and any future intelligence agency we might start is that they're going to be subject to very careful review, so that the reality is that there will be some sort of there will be a very rigorous review process that would ensure that that ought not to be a problem.
It would seem to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that Canadian political leaders expect the chiefs of their secret services to manage them in detail. If so, would not the director of a CSIS who had responsibilities for both domestic and foreign operations be stretched too thin?
No, I don't think so. Clearly, you would probably need a deputy responsible for the foreign entity and it's responsible for the domestic operation. And I have over the years given it some thought. That's the way I would want to structure it. I don't think that that's beyond the wit of man to manage either.
Another question that comes up is, in a democracy, is that perhaps too much secret power in a single pair of hands? Or are Canadians sufficiently mature that this would not be a problem?
For starters, I'm not sure. I think when people think about that issue, they're thinking about organizations like the CIA.
Yes.
Whatever Canada's intelligence organizations ultimately look like, our intelligence organizations are not going to probably not going to look like the CIA or operate like the CIA. They're going to be much smaller. They're going to be much more regulated, if you will, and much more carefully reviewed in many cases than some other agencies around the world are. So I really don't see that Canadians should have much fear about that, or that it would ever pose much of a problem. I think our bigger issue will be to ensure that if we're going to establish a foreign intelligence agency, that we actually are prepared to let it do things and aren't, frankly, sufficiently immature that we're really not prepared to contemplate what a foreign intelligence agency does and what happens when you get caught red-handed. I recall many years ago there was an incident where there were allegations in the news media that Canada was spying on a South American, Latin American country, and somebody was about to go off as ambassador to that country, and he was so incensed by the rumors about what Canada was alleged to have done that when he was presented to the president, he apologized for what Canada was alleged to have done. And unfortunately, at the time, the president is alleged to have said, "Shh, we don't talk about those things." Now, the story may be apocryphal, but it makes my point that one of the things I do worry about with the Foreign Intelligence Service is that in some ways, we are not sufficiently mature as a country to be really prepared for what a foreign intelligence agency does.
Right.
I mean, I would give you another example. A couple of years ago, the Australians signed an agreement with Papua New Guinea. I think it was Papua New Guinea on resource extraction. And sometime later, it became clear that they had collected intelligence on the negotiations and had their foreign intelligence agencies engaged in collecting information to assist in the negotiations. And there was a bit of a row in Australia over using foreign intelligence to target what is basically a third world country. Papua New Guinea in order to extract the right kind of deal from Papua New Guinea. But
Yes.
if you have a foreign intelligence agency and you're not going to use it for those kinds of things, why do you have a foreign intelligence agency?
Yes.
I mean, if you want to have a foreign intelligence agency simply to deal with adversaries such as Russia or China, then you really don't need to go any further than we have now, because in a sense, threats from Russia and China are within the mandate of CSIS as it stands now.
Are there reasons that you can think of why a foreign service should not be part of CSIS? Are there some good arguments in that direction?
The one that was always quoted to me years ago was that foreign agencies do things to people that you would not want them doing to Canadians, which is a bit similar to the issue you raised earlier. That was really the only issue which people were raising. My response to that, frankly, is that any Canadian intelligence agency is going to be subject to rigorous review. CSIS is already subject to more rigorous review than I think any other intelligence service in the world, frankly. I find it hard to believe that we would create a foreign intelligence service and not subject to rigorous review. Given that those organizations are likely to be subject to rigorous review, I think the issue of foreign services doing things outside the country and then importing the same tactics into Canada is pretty much a dead issue, given the level of review that exists in this country and is likely to continue to exist. I think it ought to be rationalized, but it will continue to be more rigorous than most other countries in the world.
Yes, indeed. Are there any closing comments that you'd like to make, Mr. Elcock?
No, I think it's an issue that occasionally raises its head. It raised its head after 9/11, and I think when people realized that there wasn't a necessity to establish a foreign intelligence service to target terrorist organizations, that issue went away again. It has raised its head again. There is a big debate within the former CSIS community right at the moment. I don't know whether you've seen any of the discussions, but there's been quite a bit of a debate there, and a number of people have written opinions and written documents and so on. I think it is something that is worth thinking about. As I said, I really don't think it's a priority. We have much bigger priorities right at the moment than starting a foreign intelligence service.
Yes.
Not the least of which is, as a former deputy of national defense, making sure that we actually to begin to rebuild our defense capacity. That in the short to medium term, seems a lot more important to me than spending a fair chunk of change trying to start a foreign intelligence agency, which will take many years before it actually repays any investment.
The cost of a foreign intelligence service for Canada would have to run upwards of $500 million a year, which is not exactly chump change for a government that runs deficits all the time.
Yes, although a lot of countries are running deficits. Canada is not the only one running deficits
True.
these days for a lot of reasons. But the reality is, we have a huge problem around defense, and a lot of that is our willingness. Not all of it. There are other issues, but a lot of it is our willingness to spend money on defense issues and national security issues. I think the priority at this point ought to be national defense, not necessarily a foreign intelligence agency.
Yeah.
That to me is just not sufficiently at the top of my list as a priority.
So I suspect a government that decided to establish a foreign intelligence service, be it part of CSIS or not, doesn't matter, they would use that as an argument. This is part of the common defense of the West. That I'm not sure how far that argument would work with our key allies.
I don't think that argument would cut a lot of ice, because it's going to be a long time before that organization actually bears fruit, frankly. Yes. And secondly, how much of it is actually going to be related to security? If you're the sort of easier targets are frankly going to be countries that are our competitors, or where there are economic issues of concern that we want greater clarity on, and so on and so forth. trying to launch efforts against the Russians or the Chinese, those are long-term, expensive, and complicated.
Yes.
Those don't happen overnight. It would be some time before you would have an organization which would have the capacity to deliver on those issues as compared to much less complicated issues.
And a small service would only be able to tackle a limited number of targets in any case.
That's true. Although and a number of people have noted that, but I think the reality is a lot of what CSIS does now is in cooperation with other services around the world. I would assume that would be true of any foreign intelligence service if we were to create one. And the reality is we actually, sometimes it surprises people, we actually are pretty good at things like intelligence. And sometimes people don't see us coming. So sometimes we can be of
Yeah.
considerable assistance to our allies, even if we are we are a smaller player than most of them.
Mr. Elcock, I want to thank you very much for taking the time with us today. You made a strong case for CSIS being assigned a much expanded foreign intelligence role. It's been good of you to join us today. We wish you all the best.
Well, the same to you, Jeff, and thank you very much. A pleasure.
That is it for our podcast today. Our next guest will be Sarah Miriam Martin-Brulé, an expert in peacekeeping intelligence, particularly UN peacekeeping intelligence. And our podcasts are distributed on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Thank you.